In today's episode of Children of Heroes, we traveled over 4 hours north from London to Leeds, where we talked to Madame Karen Ruzicka, daughter of Foreign Officer Josef Růžička.
Thank you for participating in our project Children of Heroes. Your father served in the Czechoslovak army in the United Kingdom during the Second World War. Could you tell us more about him and his life before the war and how he got to England?
Yes, my father was the eldest of 10 children, and they lived in a little village called Ivanje, which is just off the main road between the border, Mikulov and Brno. And there's a crossroads on the main road, and one of the roads goes to Ivanje, and one of them goes in the other direction. And the first time I went there, I was amazed when my father said that village was Czech-speaking, and that village was German-speaking. And I thought, how can this be? But it's still the same, and it's a relic of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that some of the villages are still German-speaking. So he was in the Czech-speaking one on one side. Another family on the German side hadn't got any children, so they went and lived with them in that village. So that my Auntie Stasi expected me to speak German. And I didn't speak German, I could speak French and Latin and a bit of Czech, but not German. When he reached 16 or so, he left school and was working on the farms. He became a customs official on the border. And he was telling me one day about us helping Jewish people to escape because of the Kristallnacht in Vienna, because of course they're very near to Vienna there. Then they were all trying to escape, a lot of the Jewish people there. And he was helping them across the border from Vienna to go north, presumably, to the sea. He joined the Czechoslovak army. And then, of course, the Nazis invaded. And a lot of the very patriotic young men were very, very upset by it and decided they were going to fight. And he escaped over to Poland and joined the Free Czech army there. And they went by boat from Poland to Boulogne in France. France wasn't then in the war, it was before the war proper had started. They were sent down to Marseille, where they joined the Foreign Legion. I went through Marseille a few years ago and I saw Foreign Legion. I said, that's where Daddy must have joined, because France wasn't fighting at that point. They got the boat over to Algeria, to Oran, and went to Sidi Bel Abbas, where the French did some training with them. And then when France wasn't drawn into the war, they went back to France. But of course, the French retreated, and they retreated back down to Marseille and then got an English boat from there to Plymouth.
What was his role in the army?
He was a warrant officer, and it's very interesting looking at the photos, because I'm almost sure that the man next to him is Gabčík. He's written down the exciting or romantic bits, but he hasn't written a lot about what he did in between. But he did go to Scotland twice. Now, I do know that the people who trained for anthropoid, they were dropped off in various wild places, parachuting in Scotland, to practice how to get to safe houses in Prague. And so they must have set up safe houses in Scotland for them to be able to go from places to get to them. And I've got a feeling my father perhaps did that, because he was a warrant officer. Both Gabčík and Kubíč were warrant officers as well, and all three of them were in the Czechoslovak army. Now, why on earth would you go to Scotland if you were guarding the Channel? So I think he must have been involved in the preparations, training these. He also then did talk about guarding the Channel, and he was stationed at Walton-on-Naze, which is where my mother was stationed. My mother was in the WAF, and they met at a dance. Mum was on radar. They weren't on the one that you often see where they're pushing boats around on little models on a table. But she said we were counting the planes out and back again.
Did your father return to Czechoslovakia after the war?
He went back to being a customs official, but of course they wanted him to be a communist member. And he said, I haven't escaped and done all this to have a communist government. I want the democratic system. And by this time he'd married my mother and they'd got my sister. And then she'd gone out to live with him, expecting everything to settle down after the war.
In Czechoslovakia?
Yeah. She flew out on a bomber, sitting on mats on the bottom floor of the plane. My sister was 18 months, I think, and she fell on the floor at the airport and dislocated her hip. So Mum was having to carry her everywhere. And when they met my father, of course, she had no idea who this strange man was who couldn't talk to her and didn't know him at all and wouldn't let him carry her because everything was strange and she was hurting and everything. But when she got there, my father was still in the army, and it was the army that were using the United Nations to distribute surplus supplies, mostly from Americans, to the villages in Czechoslovakia, that my mother wasn't with him. He was being sent around different places.
Your mother was alone in Czechoslovakia after the end of the Second World War, and your father was in Czechoslovakia, but he was being sent to different places. So they weren't together a lot of the time. She was in Nepomuk to start with. She eventually went to stay with a cousin in another village quite near Ivania. She loved it. She loved the country and she loved the people. But when she was expecting me, the communists were obviously taking over. My father was denied his passport because he wouldn't be communist and he wouldn't carry on being a customs... Well, he would have been a customs official if they'd let him, but they wouldn't let him because he wouldn't be communist. And so he escaped. My mother came back to England because they decided it was more sensible for me to be born in England. Well, they got back legally because she was English, but they wouldn't give him his passport even though he said he'd got an English wife and 2 English children. Well, there's another one on the way. And he escaped into Germany, but he was followed by the secret police and he was arrested and put in prison. And then eventually they let him out again. But he still couldn't get his passport, so he couldn't leave. He's got a funny story as well when he was trying to get across the Polish border, where there was a farmer with some cows and he pretended he belonged to the farm and went along, sending the cows. He went down then to the Moravian border and worked on the sort of family farm and eventually managed to escape over the border onto the road to Vienna. There were 2 of them, but it was the Russian zone. They hid in ditches with searchlights and so on, but eventually managed to get to Vienna. When he got there, the British embassy would not do anything. Even though he'd got English wife and 2 English children, he couldn't get out again. The Americans helped, but of course he hadn't got any money either, so they were having to do odd bits of work and so on to get enough to live on. And eventually he did get to France and did come over to England. It was 1950. I was 3.5 before we met. He'd never seen me. This is the day he arrived, so this is the first time I saw him. So that's me, that's my grandmother, that's my dad, and that's Aneshka. So Aneshka was named after this nun who died, and she'd been my father's favourite little sister, and so he wanted her to be called Aneshka, which she didn't like because nobody could say it, of course. We lived in a mining village on the Nottinghamshire-Derbyshire border, which had got typical little houses and things, and this house, I can remember it very well. I was there till I was 9. And there was no bathroom and there was no toilet inside. The toilet was outside. And we had a tin bath in front of the fire. And they call them Rangers, Yorkie Rangers, where there was a fire and an oven at the side of it. It was all right. It was typical of the time. My sister was mad on Robin Hood, so we always were firing. There were arrows with a suction cap on the end. We were always firing them at the coal house door. She was always Robin Hood, and I was Maid Marian and the Sheriff of Nottingham and everything else, because we were in Robin Hood country. What did your father do in England?
I mean, he was a very intelligent man and he wanted to go to university, but he hadn't got the language. So he couldn't get a job indoors. And he was working on open cast mining sites or building sites. I've found this with a lot of Czechs. It's a much, much healthier attitude than we have in England. People in England will sort of look down their noses and say, oh, fancy working on a muddy site like that or whatever, why hasn't he got a decent job and things. Whereas my father always took a great delight in his strength and doing a good job outside. And when I've been there, I've found exactly the same attitude because nearly all the family build their own houses.
You decided to study music.
Yeah. I went to a girls'
being very good in math.
I was good at everything actually. I was one of these awful people. I went to a little village school in this mining village, and we had an exam to get to grammar school. There were sort of intelligence tests that we'd never done in school. I thought it was great. It was like just puzzles to me. And what the interesting thing was, I put my name on the first paper as Ruzicka, And then on the second paper, I just learnt how to write Ruzicka with all the accents on. And I wrote it in the Czech way, you see, and the headmaster called me and said, "What's all this?" So I said, "Oh, that's what it should be." I said, "That's the feminine version." And he said, "Well, I don't think we'd better do that for this, do you? I think you should put the same as the other one." The problem in England is my birth certificate says name of father. When the Czechs and Slovaks split and we had to go to the bank, and I handed in my passport, they looked past me to the man at the side to give him the money. And I said, "It's me."
Finally, you ended up with a teaching degree from Cambridge University.
Yeah, if you wanted to teach, you'd got to do a diploma after you'd done the degree, unless your degree was in education. And mine wasn't, mine was in music. So we went to Cambridge. To be perfectly honest, I didn't really know whether I wanted to teach, but Cambridge has got a huge reputation for doing music outside the lectures. And I did 50 concerts in the year. When we were looking for somewhere to stay, I knocked on this door. And this very dishevelled man came to the door, with very short-sighted, with spectacles, still in his pyjamas and things, and sort of looked at me, and I said, "I'm looking for somewhere to stay for the year in Cambridge, you see." And he's sort of going, "Oh, what are we doing?" And then I heard a cello in the background. I said, "Somebody plays the cello." And he said, "We're a string quartet, me and my wife are the violinists, and the children are learning cello and piano and viola." And I said, "I play viola." And they said, "Come." You know, it was really funny, but the children were really good.
Was music something you always wanted to do?
The school I went to was very, very musical. We had a marvellous music teacher. In my group of friends at school, nearly all of us either played something or sang in the choir. When I was about 14, after I'd started playing viola, the Leeds Symphony Orchestra I played with for over 20 years, I would think. And I played viola and I led the viola section, so I'm there. That's me. But the other thing I've done a lot of is Leeds Philharmonic Choir. This is Leeds Town Hall with the big organ at the background. There's another choir there, because if you look, they've got pink blouses instead of our red ones.
After the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia in 1989, you decided to go to work as a teacher in Brno.
I didn't really decide to go. We were very excited by the revolution, obviously, but my father had died in 82 and we couldn't speak Czech. And I never thought I'd ever go again because I didn't know how to get in touch with the family. And then somebody said to me, "Do you know there's a Czech centre in Leeds?" And there was this man called Pavel. So I met Pavel, and he brought a friend of his over, who he eventually married, Marketa. And Marketa said, "Have you got any phone numbers for the family?" And I said, "Yes, but I can't speak Czech." So she said, "Give me the phone number." And immediately picked up the phone and started talking to my cousin Anička in Mikulov. The next thing was we were going over and met them for the first time. And it was amazing. I was trying out little bits of Czech I'd been trying, and they kept saying, "No, no, 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 no." And I'm thinking, oh dear, none of it works. I've done this all wrong. They're saying no to everything, you see. And it took me, I don't know, quite a few minutes, half an hour or something, to realise that no in Czech is actually yes, because it's ano, and they missed the a off. And it's still complicated. Every Friday at school, they would send notices around all the schools, and they would advertise jobs that were going. And one Friday, one of the teachers came in and said, "Hey, Karen, we've found a job for you." And there was the job saying that at Slovenské městské gymnasium in Brno, they were looking for teachers to teach other subjects in English. And I ended up going there.
You learned Czech to be able to communicate with your relatives?
I had to. I met 76 close relatives while I was there. I never found the pronunciation particularly difficult because it's sort of phonetic. So long as you learn the alphabet, you can read it. I always remember the first time they gave me a newspaper and I read out the first paragraph, and they all understood it. And they said, "Do you know what it means?" I said, "I don't know what a word of it means." I could just read it, but I can't understand it at all.
Would you say your father's Czech origin had a big impact on your life?
It's had a huge impact, but not till after the revolution, until we could go there. Going back there has been a huge influence, not just on me, but on an awful lot of other people. And the things that have happened as a result of it are quite amazing. Not only did all the family get back, it was a huge thing for my mother to meet her sisters-in-law, and the way they just welcomed her back and loved seeing her again, even though they'd been divorced, my parents. It was just really good that she was accepted. They had been very kind to her when she'd been living out there. The other thing is, I taught handicapped kids here, and while I was in Burnham, I asked people where the special school was. I found the school. In fact, it was within walking distance from the school I was teaching at. The headmaster came to the gate, and he looked like a sort of Father Christmas in shorts. So I ended up going in and teaching wheelchair dancing. And we did the dances at this ball, and the Minister of Education was there, and it got in the papers. And my aunt said, "You've only been here for less than a year and you're in the papers, and I've been here for nearly 80 years and I'm not in the papers." And but marvellously, I mean, this is a real legacy for them. They're all still doing it, and they've really spread, and everybody's started doing what I started, which is great. So that was one thing that we left there.